We'll jump in then. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for being here. So I am Martina Shabram, and I'm the Engaging Allies Coordinator at Sexual Assault Support Services, SASS. Engaging Allies means that I am in charge of our education and outreach programs at SASS, so I get to do stuff like this. Usually I get to do this in person, so this is like a unique experience for me that I'm doing this remotely. And it feels kind of, I'm just gonna acknowledge that it feels really strange to me to be talking about this subject matter without being able to be physically present with you all. So I hope that we can all work through this remote experience together. And I'm hoping that even though I can't like see and feel into like what everybody's emotional space is like, which is part of how I think about my teaching most of the time, hopefully we'll still be able to make this a really safe and comfortable place for everyone. So tonight we're gonna talk about disclosures, which is one of, I think, the most foundational skills that we can build for supporting survivors. Just a tiny bit more housekeeping in case anybody missed this. During this presentation, I'll try to pause as often as possible for questions. If you can send those questions either to the whole group in the chat, or if you're not comfortable with people knowing who asked what question, you can send them privately to Trevor. And he will pause when the time comes, and we'll read those for us so that we can answer. It's easier to send those to him rather than to me directly because I'm looking at my screen with my presentation up, and so it's a little harder for me to follow the chat. So I hope that's okay. We've also already started to acknowledge some of the emotional challenges of a conversation like this. And so I do want to just pause and say that you know, whatever you need to do to feel comfortable and safe while we're having this discussion, I trust you to do those things. Talking about these issues is really hard. And sometimes it like catches us off guard. So I hope everyone had a chance to opt in to this conversation. I hope everyone had a chance to do whatever preparation that they need to do to feel really comfortable in this and to really consent to this. And I want to honor anyone who at any point feels like they need a break. If your video is off and you want to just step away from the computer for a couple minutes, no one will know. You can also leave the video entirely, whether that's to go to Ritu's chat and have some direct advocacy there, or like, who knows, maybe you're leaving because you just spilled tea all down the front of your blouse, or your dog is barking at something in the other room. There's a lot of reasons a person might leave a call. So you can also feel safe and comfortable in knowing that like no one is monitoring who has stayed and who has gone, and no one's going to feel, no one's going to be able to identify you if you leave for that reason. I also want to note that up on the screen is the number for our 24/7 crisis and support hotline at SASS. I'll speak more in a moment about what exactly that is, but I'm just going to say that I think it's a great thing to have that number in your phone. I think having those kinds of support and resources available at all times is really useful. I know that in my phone, I keep not only our hotline number, but also the Cahoots number and the suicide hotline. And I'll tell you, there have been a lot of times when I have been presented with a situation in the community that I don't necessarily feel comfortable dealing with on my own, and have felt really glad that I could just call Cahoots right away. So it's always nice to have that resource. So let's talk about what our services are briefly. So I'll say right away that SASS serves all people of all genders. Many times sexual violence is sort of considered to be an issue that is only relevant for people who are female identified, and we know that that is just not true, right? Any person, any gender can experience sexual violence, and SASS really strives to be a space where all people of all genders can feel like they are being welcomed and like that space is for them. We serve survivors who are 15 years old and older. For folks who are under 15, we refer out to Kids First here in Lane County. But we also serve partners, families, and friends of survivors of any age. And I think that's really important for folks to know. Trauma is experienced by communities as a whole. And so there is a particular trauma of being the primary survivor. And there's also a lot of trauma that comes from loving someone who has been harmed. And our services are available for all folks. So for example, even if there was a survivor who was too young for us to serve, like a child, we would still be able to provide services for their parents or older siblings or something like that. Three sort of essential things to say. Ritu was already briefly mentioning our confidentiality. So at SASS, our employees have a level of privilege, excuse me, that's like really high. So we legally, as privileged advocates, cannot share any information about our clients with anyone or any agency unless we first have their permission. So you can think of that as kind of like the inverse of mandatory reporting. So that's a really strong level of confidentiality. That means that even if we are subpoenaed to, testify in court, we cannot do that without survivors' permission. We can't disclose information to DHS, to ICE, to law enforcement. And that means that our clients really have a chance to ask us questions that they might not be able to feel comfortable and safe doing so elsewhere. And that unless they have given us their express, written, and time-limited consent, we aren't able to share any information. Now, I will also say that there are two staff members, myself and our counselor, who have what's called mixed status. So because of some other roles that I play in the community, I'm also an elected member of the school board. I am also a mandatory reporter for folks under the age of 18. And that's a little cumbersome sometimes to hold both of those things. But what's really important to know is even as a person who is mandated to report violence against folks under 18, that does not mean statutorily that if someone shares something with me, I immediately have to check their ID. I don't know how old anybody in this call is, right? So unless I have that kind of specific information, that mandatory reporting status does not come up as often in my work as one might think. We also provide all of our services free for survivors, partners, and families. And we strive to have the highest level of accessibility possible. So our services can always be provided in English and Spanish, and we provide interpretation services for other languages upon request. We try to make sure that all of our materials are available in English and Spanish as well. And if there are any important questions that are coming in, I saw something flash in the chat box. Trevor, go ahead and jump in. But I'll move on. So maybe one of the most essential services that we offer is our crisis and support hotline, which runs 24 hours a day, every day of the year, even on holidays, or times when our office would be closed. There will still be a real live human person who is answering that line. So on the crisis line, our staff are not acting as therapists or counselors, but instead are there as advocates. So we're specially trained in crisis advocacy, in supportive listening, and in trauma-informed care. So some people call in the acute aftermath of a trauma. Some people call with really specific questions. Some people call just because they are like really feeling it in the moment and want to know that there's another human who understands or who's listening. And some folks call, when they are decades into their healing process, because it still is meaningful for them to be able to talk about what they have experienced and to talk about trauma in a space that really feels safe. So any person is totally welcome to reach out to that line, including all the people who are on this call, and to get support if that feels important to them. In normal times, when we are not all engaging in a fun quarantine, we have drop-in advocacy at our office, and that's really for folks who just feel like a little in-person support would be better, and that does not require an appointment. Hopefully, that will happen again sometime soon when we all get to be in physical space again together. The other one of our services that is perhaps most important is our 24/7 medical advocacy. So again, that is every day of the year, all hours of night and day. And typically that happens when a person in the emergency department discloses to their medical provider that they have experienced sexual assault. So at that point, under Oregon law, that person is entitled to receive support from a crisis advocate. And in Lane County, we are the agency that does that. So we're there when we go to the hospital, we're there to support survivors and help them make decisions about what kind of care and treatment they might want, to help them process what they have experienced, to help advocate for them or help them navigate a medical space that can be not always super comfortable. Some survivors choose to have evidence collected for the potential use in a criminal trial. This is what's called a sexual assault forensic evidence exam. You will sometimes hear people refer to this as a rape kit. I'm not going to use that language, but you can know that that's what I mean. And this is performed by a specially trained nurse called a sexual assault nurse examiner. So some survivors choose to do that, some don't. In the state of Oregon, a person who's over 18 can make the decision for themselves and can decide whether they want to have an anonymous kit taken, which means that they would have their evidence collected, their name would not be attached to it and would not get tested, but it would wait so that at any point in the next 70 years, if they did want to report and engage with law enforcement, they would be able to have their evidence at that point tested. Some survivors choose to consent to some, but not all of the exam. And some survivors do not want to have that exam at all. And perhaps the reason they're in the hospital is for medical care or treatment following their experience. So it is not our job as advocates to make that decision for them. It is our job to support them in whatever choice they make and to help give them the resources that they need and the information that they need so that they can feel confident and comfortable with whatever decision they do end up making. Like I said, some folks are engaging in the criminal justice system, and some survivors do choose to make police reports. For folks who choose to do that, we can provide support and advocacy during the reporting process and during potential legal proceedings. For example, some survivors choose to make the police report in our office instead of either doing that in the hospital or going to the police station. As you can imagine, our office is a lot more comfortable and trauma-informed than the fluorescently lit interrogation room at the police department, right? Sometimes my dog is at the office and we have tea, so it's a lot more comfortable there. And some survivors also request accompaniment to court during the proceedings of their case. And so that's all for support through the criminal law process. There's also legal advocacy available for survivors who are engaging in civil law, such as filing for protective orders, which are sometimes referred to as restraining orders, or dealing with family law issues like custody. We don't have any lawyers on staff and we cannot provide legal advice, but we can support survivors and help them connect with lawyers who will either give them free legal advice or will end up representing them pro bono. And then the final service that we offer is counseling and support groups. Again, right now, this is on pause. We have the intention of making this available remotely, but we are still working out some of the complexities around confidentiality and some of these streaming platforms like Zoom. So we have one counselor on staff who offers free one-on-one counseling, and there's always a wait. So if people don't want to wait for her availability, we can also help them access resources outside of SASS. And then some folks just want to be engaged in community support, and that is what our support groups are for. So at the moment, we have 3 support groups that run regularly. Every week, we have one group for folks who are female identified and one group for folks who are male identified. And twice a month, we have a group for folks who identify as members of the LGBTQIA+ community. And these, again, they're drop-in, they're free, there's no registration needed, and they're facilitated by our SASS staff and volunteers, not by therapists. So I'll pause there. Are there any questions that we want to answer related to SASS services, to legal reporting stuff, to any of those things?
I have not received any myself, so.
Okay. Excellent.
I didn't see any in the chat. If you put something in the chat and I didn't see it, go ahead and post it again real quick, but I didn't see any.
All right. Well, I'll continue to move forward, and just remember that it is totally fine for us to stop and answer those questions if you have them. Some of you on this call may have already heard that outline of our services before, and so you're like, no, I don't have questions. I know this stuff. Good. So if we're going to talk about disclosures, I want to start by getting some context and definitions. I think it's really important as we're having a conversation about how we can support survivors and about like the particular trauma that a person might experience if they have experienced sexual violence. It's pretty important that we're all on the same page in terms of the kind of language that we use and the kind of concepts that we understand. So I'm going to really quickly run through some context and definitions that I want to make sure we all share. So the first is, I think it's important that we define what we mean when we say sexual violence. You'll notice I've said that probably a number of times already. You'll notice that I say that typically instead of saying something like rape. That's for a really specific reason, right? Rape has some really different connotations. It has legal implications, right? It's a legal term. It also has a whole host of social and cultural assumptions and associations that might go along with it, including things like different understandings of what counts as sex. So these are all really complicated concepts. And it can also be used as a way to gatekeep, right? As what counts and what doesn't. And it's important for us at SASS to acknowledge that we are here for people who have survived any type of sexual violence. So we are going to continue to use that term as an umbrella term for this spectrum of actions that violate someone's consent or boundaries. Right? So sexual violence includes any non-consensual sex act, including unwanted touching and harassment, right? Even verbal harassment. So we do not gatekeep. We are never going to ask somebody to justify why they identify as a survivor or why they feel they need our support. And there is no like assessment for who counts and who doesn't, or what counts and what doesn't. And since we are talking about sexual violence in the context of consent, also important that we get that definition out there. I'm gonna just assume that everyone on this call has like a fairly great understanding of consent. That's my assumption. But I do wanna point out that at SASS, one of the things that we think about a lot is that consent has to be able to be given freely and enthusiastically, and no always has to be an option, right? So consent can always be retracted. And that is important because the vast majority of sexual assaults do not involve a weapon or result in major injuries. But that does not mean that there was not violence, right? That there was not coercion. So things like intoxicants, things like unequal power dynamics, things like social pressuring, all of those affect a person's capacity to consent. And therefore, we are not ever going to define sexual violence as requiring physical violence even. Okay, final bit of context that I want us to discuss. And this, okay, honestly, this is a big one, right? So I'm gonna briefly, like the most briefly, just mention intersectional systems of oppression. Obviously, this deserves its own presentation or series of presentations or like lifetime of study because it's so essential to understanding how we operate in the world. But I do think it's important to just briefly touch on these issues because systems of oppression directly relate to a person's experience of sexual violence. And also we understand sexual violence as resulting from oppressive systems. I also want to say that intersectionality as a concept comes from the work of Kimberly Crenshaw and other Black feminist scholarship. And I want to always make sure that I'm acknowledging that we owe a huge debt to the people who have done this intellectual work. So really, really simply put, intersectionality asks us to consider the ways that the different identities we each carry affect each of us in complex ways, these complex and interrelated ways, right? A simplistic understanding of identity and oppression would say, like, here are these different identities. I have a few up on the screen, and a person has or is one of those things and only one of those things. And once they are one of those things, that's just who they are. Intersectionality pushes on that a lot and says, like, no, we're never just one thing. We're always all of these things at the same time. And the way those things interact is much more nuanced, right? So our intertwining and interrelating identities affect the kind of experience we have in the world. Now, this is particularly important if we think about how we support survivors, right? If I come into a space to support a survivor and I assume that that person operates within the world the same way I do, then I am likely not going to be providing them the support that they truly deserve, right? Because I walk through the world as a white woman. I'm middle class. I'm perceived as able-bodied. I have a lot of education, right? So I walk into most spaces, and sure, I receive some oppression because I'm a woman, but I also receive a lot of unearned privilege for my race and my class and all of those things. And so if I were to report to an emergency department and disclose that I've experienced sexual violence, I will be treated differently than someone with different identities. And I'll tell you from experience, having seen this, a person who walks into an emergency department and discloses and is also perceived as being unhoused, or is a trans person, or is a person of color, they will be treated differently than I will. And the kind of access that they might have to support resources might also be very different, right? Again, I have access to things like health insurance and therapy. I have safe and secure housing. So if I am working with an unhoused survivor and I'm giving that person advice and support and advocacy, assuming that they have the same resources I have, then I will not be treating them in the way that they deserve. So our differing identities really fundamentally change the ways we experience sexual violence, our vulnerabilities in a society, and the ways that we receive care. I want to pause real quick, and I want to throw the mic over to Jon Davies, who will jump in for a couple minutes and talk a little bit about how that might be particularly relevant when we're talking about folks who are male identified and are also survivors of sexual violence. So I'm going to hand that off to him for a moment.
Thank you, Martina. And I just want to say we who have been in the community a long time really value the contribution which SASS has done for so many years supporting survivors, and our community just really owes SASS a great deal for all the services you provided for so many years. I'm going to talk just very briefly about male survivors. You know, we often think about men as perpetrators. We know that men commit approximately 90% of the sexual abuse that occurs, or sexual violence that occurs. But not as many people know about men as survivors. And it's been estimated that 1 in 6 boys are sexually abused by the time they are 18. And 1 in 71 men will be raped in their lifetime. And 22% of men will experience some form of sexual violence. And this sexual violence of males goes across all different ethnic groups, Latino, African American, Asian American, Native American. This goes across the context of men, and of course, different sexual orientations for sure. Just one other thing I wanted to say is that sexual abuse harms boys and girls in ways that are both similar and different, but equally harmful. And there's a lot of pushback about understanding about men and experiencing sexual violence. But I think maybe I'll come in later on as you get more into the details of the effects of sexual violence. And maybe I can come back in a little bit and share a little bit more about that.
Excellent. Thank you. Did you have anything else you wanted to add in this moment?
I just want to say that, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but just that the men being sexual violence survivors is a total incongruence of what they are socialized to believe, because men are supposed to socialize to be strong and independent and not need anybody. Mm-hmm. And of course, being a survivor of sexual violence puts them in a situation where they need just the opposite of what their socialization is taught them. I'll share more about that later.
Yeah, and this is so important to the way that as an advocate, we would want to provide resources and support for a person who is male identified, right? Again, if we're thinking about just the differences in experience based on a person's identity, if I walk into an emergency department and I disclose sexual violence, I'm likely, because of a lot of factors, I'm likely to be believed. The same may not be true for a person who's male identified. There's also no challenge to my identity as a woman if I experience sexual violence, right? There is sometimes a challenge to a person's male identity. Yes. And those are all things that mean that the way that we are dealing with that person in the moment really needs to address the particularities of that person's intersectional identities, right? And so we can never treat a person as if they're just one thing, right? So, all right, we've started now talking a little bit about how we support people. So let's jump into the actual stuff. I really want us to get comfortable with disclosures. This is like the thing I want you to add to your toolkit. So we're going to talk about what disclosures are and why they're so important, and then how we can work as advocates, whether that is as a professional advocate or just as like a human person who really cares about these issues and wants to be of service, how we can make space for really positive disclosure experiences, because these are really some of the foundational skills, like in some way, right? A disclosure and how we receive that disclosure is the first moment that we have with a survivor in recognition that they are a survivor, right? So it's a really big thing for us. And I'll say that I think these skills are relevant whether we're dealing with folks who are survivors of sexual violence or survivors of other forms of trauma. These are really some of the foundational principles of trauma-informed care. So let's get into it. I want to talk about what a disclosure is and why it is so important. So simply put, right, a disclosure is when someone is offering their story to someone else, right? They are disclosing something about themselves. So at its simplest, it's sharing. I tend to think, though, of it more like somebody asking me to hold space for them, right? To like make a container that they can, place this story into, right? They're asking for space to say something out loud that maybe they haven't said out loud before, or that they haven't said out loud to another person before, or that they don't like saying out loud, that is hurtful, or that makes them feel really uncomfortable feelings to talk about. So they're asking for that to be okay, right? To make space for that. They're asking for me to make space for them to have a moment that's about them and not about me, right? That's really about not my response to them, but about their need to speak. So this is pretty profound, right? This is about really showing up for someone and hearing them, believing them, valuing their story, and giving them the opportunity to have that moment. That is all incredibly significant, but there's also more that is going on in a disclosure experience, because there's also some real physiological stuff happening in the brain when a person tells their story. So I want to nerd out a little bit, and I'm going to reference Jennifer Freyd's work. And UO is really lucky to have her on your faculty, because her research about the psychology and the physiology of trauma is really foundational in the kind of work that we do at SASS. And most importantly, I think, in terms of disclosures, is her theory of shareability. So I'm going to give the definition that she has. She has this wonderful, pithy definition of shareability. And there's a citation here on the bottom. At the end of this presentation, I will also have a slide with references in case you want to go back. But let's break down what she says here. So I'll read this in chunks. So to start with, she says, much childhood abuse happens without the opportunity for communication. So this theory is sort of specifically in reference to folks who experience childhood abuse, which is abuse that happens during like the foundational and developmental time for their brain. It is also really relevant and useful for thinking about people who've experienced abuse at any point in their life, but particularly true for folks who experience childhood abuse. And so, of course, much of the time this is happening when a person does not have the opportunity to communicate with someone else what has happened, right? They don't have the safety to share. They don't have a person who's actually going to listen to them. So this happens in silence. It happens alone. And therefore, to go on with her quote here, memory for non-shared abuse experiences may be fundamentally different in memory, right? So it's actually stored differently. It functions differently as a memory. Non-shared memories may be more implicit than explicit, more procedural than declarative, more perceptual than language-based. So when we don't put things into a story, when we don't have a chance to share something and have it received, we may not have the same kind of linguistic structure around it. I'm going to acknowledge here that I'm a doctor of literature. That's what my doctorate is in. So the fact that this is about stories like this hits right at the spot of nerdery that I love. But what she's saying here is that when we don't have the opportunity to communicate, these memories may end up being stored as more intangible feelings, as sensory input, as emotional feelings, but not as really clear stories. So when we communicate about an event, we may change the memories to become more language-based, explicit, declarative, and categorical. Sharing a story and having another person receive that and believe it and validate it and share it back turns it into something different, right? Stories are things we know as humans how to work with, right? They have beginnings and middles and ends. They have narrative structure. They're something that we can actually think about in a more concrete way, right? Try to think about just an emotional feeling. It's really hard to actually hold that in our brain space, whereas thinking about a story about that emotional experience is something we can deal with. So telling a story and having it believed, right? Having your reality affirmed is huge. And what her research shows is that this can actually change how that memory is stored. So a disclosure is actually doing physiological work in a person's brain if it is happening in this positive way, right? It is rewiring the way that they are perceiving that memory. So that means that this is an incredibly powerful moment between people. And there's a lot of other data that backs this up, right? There's plenty of papers, and I'll give you two at the end on my reference page that are particularly interesting, that show that disclosing can have positive emotional effects, but that if the disclosure experience is negative, then the opposite is true. Then disclosing will have negative emotional effects, right? So this is a lot. This means simply that when someone offers you a disclosure, you now have a lot of power. You have power to support them in their healing, to help them create a reality that is healing and supportive for them, or potentially, to do harm. And that means that we have a lot of responsibility, and that's why building this skill set is so important. I'll pause here and see if there are any questions before I move on.
I love that.
Right? That makes me feel a lot of feelings. Thank you, Jennifer Freyd.
Yeah. I did try your link and it doesn't work.
Oh, apologies.
But no one has sent me any questions either. So.
Okay. Well, there will be other better links at the end of this presentation. So thank you.
Yay. Thank you.
All right. So all that being said, right, disclosures being so important, let's build that skill set and let's get really comfortable with these disclosures. And so here are our sort of 4 steps to creating a positive disclosure experience. Listening without changing, believing without questioning, validating without assuming, and supporting without deciding. This is a lot easier said than done. So we're going to jump into each of these and think about them one at a time. So let's start with listening without changing. So this first skill is listening, which often is thought of as like a really simple passive thing that we do without trying, right? Like, oh, if you have ears, you're listening. But that's actually not true, right? Listening is actually a really complex act that actually takes practice to get good at. And that's because we're trained to engage in conversation, right? Which is different than just listening, right? If you're sitting down for coffee with someone and they're saying something and you're just not responding, that's awkward, right? That's uncomfortable. We're trained to share something of ourselves and to go back and forth. And that's all really good, but that's not just listening, right? And good listening often really requires not making things about you. So think of a time that you had to share something big with someone else and you were nervous about it. What were the things you were nervous about? Probably you were nervous about managing the other person's response, right? Like maybe I would be worried that that person will get mad at me. Or maybe I'm worried that they're going to get mad at somebody else on my behalf, and then I'm going to have to worry about what they do. Or maybe I'm worried that they're going to cry and they're going to be despondent, and now I'm going to have to comfort them and tell them that it's all okay. or that they're going to blame me, or that they're going to change how I feel, or on and on, right? All of those scenarios, my anxiety wouldn't really be about me, it would be about them, right? About their response. So all of those things are really fair emotional responses. When we hear things that are challenging, it is fair to feel angry, to cry, to do all of those things. But in a disclosure experience, it's our job to not make our emotions the responsibility of the survivor, right? The responsibility of the person who is disclosing. And that means that we really want to practice just listening. So some particular skills within this to practice. The first is honestly being quiet. It really is hard, right? Really to stop trying to have conversation. And really to think about like, what are my responses? That doesn't mean that we need to be like utterly silent. That is also really off-putting. And it also might make that person feel like you've checked out. So when I say be quiet, I don't mean be soundless. I mean, make it about them. So affirmative listening sounds are really great. Things like, yeah, I hear that. That makes a lot of sense. And when they are asking for input, or when there is a pause, using mirroring language, which means that you're reflecting back to them what they have just said to you, right? So if I am receiving a disclosure or having a conversation with a survivor, and they are, describing that they feel really like stressed out and they don't know what happened, and things are really blurry in their mind and it's really confusing and they're scared about that, and then they pause, I'm not going to start talking about myself in that moment, but I might say something like, oh, wow, it really sounds like you feel so confused about what happened. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. A lot of survivors feel really confused. So I'm engaging in something that looks more like conversation, but is actually really letting their story and their experience continue to be at the center of what's going on. And I'm showing them that I believe what's happening with them, like their reality is real for me. So we're going to be quiet. And we also really want to pay attention to our body language. So if you're tense, that is going to be obvious. If you're awkward or uncomfortable or embarrassed, that's going to be obvious. If you're making like big facial expressions or seeming shocked, all of that is a lot, right? So we want to think a lot about what we're doing with our body and how we're positioning our body, right? Like where is our body in relationship to the survivor? So for example, if I go into a hospital room with a survivor, and I know that that's like a pretty unique space to be, but I think it's a good example. There's a lot of things that I'm going to immediately start figuring out that I can do with my body. So the first is like, can I sit down, right? Like, am I looming over them? That is really aggressive body language. So can I sit down? And if I can't sit down, like where can I put my body so that I am not like over them? And if I can sit down, like where should I put the chair, right? If I sit in a place that is blocking their view of the door, that might feel really anxiety inducing for someone who is having a lot of like hypervigilance or jumpiness. Or maybe it's really useful for me to put my body between, people barging into the room and the survivor in the bed. Or maybe it's useful for me to put my body between a family member in the room and them, right? So we can think a lot about like literally where is my body positioned. And also really thinking about like being careful with touch. Touch can be really useful, but it can also be really invasive. So sometimes a gentle hand on the shoulder or like holding someone's hand is helpful. And in fact, I've had times when survivors have told me that like they feel disgusting, like they've been spoiled, or that their body is gross, that like no one will touch them or look at them. And in a moment like that, it might be really useful to hold their hand or put a hand on their shoulder and really show that like, I am here with you and you are not untouchable. If they're really scared or if they are experiencing like a painful moment, it might be helpful to offer my hand to be held, but I'm always going to ask first. And I'm never going to ask them for a hug. This is one of my major pet peeves. Maybe there's going to be a circumstance where you, as someone receiving a disclosure, like knows that person really well and knows that there is nothing they want in the world more than like you to hug them and hold them while they cry. That's going to be the outlier. Most of the time when I see people in these settings offering the survivor a hug, it's about the person feeling uncomfortable, not about what the survivor actually wants in that moment. So hugs off the table. And then our final sort of strategy here is maybe the hardest, and that is to remain neutral. We've already talked about how important it is to not make the survivor take responsibility for your emotions, whether you're like angry or sad or whatever it is. But neutrality is also how you're responding to them and how you're framing things. So when you're uncomfortable with how bad a person feels, you might want to make it better, right? Like, oh, look on the positive side. Or I'm so glad that, this happened, but not that. Oh, it could have been worse. But that's not your job in that moment, right? You are not there to make it positive or to fix it. I understand why people have the impulse to turn things positive, but it is so invalidating to say to somebody, I feel really bad. Something really bad has happened. And have that person respond with something like, oh, well, every dark cloud has a silver lining. That's so invalidating of my feelings, right? I honestly think that this is one of the really unhealthy fixations that our culture has on like positivity or good vibes only, or like whatever it is. Like just look at how we're treating this quarantine, right? I've seen so many memes that are like, if you don't come out of quarantine with like your whole life worked out and a six-pack and your book written, then it wasn't about not having time, it was about you. Like, this is horrible. This is a bad experience. Like, let's just let it be bad. Like, let's have that be okay. Feeling bad is part of the like beautiful range of human emotions, and it's okay to sometimes feel bad. And I've heard from people in hospital rooms who say things like, I'm so sorry, I'm crying. I've heard survivors say that they feel guilty for being traumatized. And I've heard that from people who are decades out from their trauma and folks who are like days out from a traumatic experience, right? That all says that like our need to perform positivity is damaging. So there is a lot of power in saying to someone, I am so sorry that you feel like this right now. And it is also okay for you to not be okay. You don't need to take care of me. You don't need to worry about how I feel. I am okay just being here with you. That's really powerful, because we're not going to try to change their story and make it better. We're not going to try to change their experience and make it something it's not. I'll also caution against problem solving unless they're like specifically asking. Most of the time people want to share what is overwhelming or what is stressful or what is too much for them. And that doesn't mean that they are presenting you a to-do list that they're hoping you'll check off. It feels dismissive and it takes away their power. So even in a situation where a survivor asks like, Martina, I need you to tell me what to do right now, I'm going to respond, I can't decide for you because you are the expert on your own life. Would it be helpful for you in this moment for me to walk you through some of the options you have? Right? So I'm giving them an opportunity to consent to hearing some information that they might find useful in making their decision, but I'm not making the decision for them. So this is harder than it seems, but this is one of the really important things that we can do. Are there any questions that have come up about this particular skill? All right, I'm going to keep it going then. So our second skill is believing without questioning. So you don't need proof to support that person. Let's just like get it out of the way that the likelihood statistically that someone is lying to you about an experience of sexual violence is really, really low. There is not a lot that a person gains by disclosing an experience of sexual violence, and there's a lot that a person may fear that they can lose. So the likelihood that they're lying, very small. And even if they were, you lose nothing. It costs you nothing to be there with them in that moment and support them. So you don't need to question, you don't need to get to the truth, you don't need to get all the details out. The survivor will share what they're comfortable sharing, and you don't need to get more from them. So when I walk into a space with a survivor, I'll tell them, you can tell me as much or as little about what happened as you would like. Some people really want to share like everything, like they want to get it all out, all the details. And some people are like, I don't even want to say that a thing happened to me, right? And I don't need that person to do anything for me to offer them support. And this is important because it is really easy for that questioning to slip into victim blaming. And this is maybe one of the most essential things to practice, right? Which is never blaming the survivor and remembering that the perpetrator is the only person at fault. Even the best intentions, questioning can feel like blame, right? Like, oh, where were you? What were you wearing? Were you drinking? That all can sound, even with great intentions, a lot like, what did you do to get yourself into this situation? And that's not okay. And I think that this can be a lot more challenging than people want to admit, right? Sometimes the questioning is coming from a place of frustration, right? Maybe a person is frustrated that this has happened. You know, sometimes people have been engaging in risk-taking behaviors when they have experienced sexual violence, right? Maybe the behavior they were engaging in made it easier for a perpetrator to target them. That still does not mean that they are to blame, right? The perpetrator still made the active choice to assault them. And that's important to remember. Sexual assault isn't an accident. It doesn't happen by accident. It is an active and intentional choice that a perpetrator makes. And it's not a natural consequence of risky behavior, right? If I go to a party and I drink way too much, I have taken certain risks and I have invited the possibility that I'm going to puke all over the place and wake up with a terrible hangover. I have invited that. That is my fault. I would not have invited assault, right? That would still be the responsibility of a perpetrator who took advantage of a person's diminished capacity. So if a person is frustrated with a survivor's behavior, like check in with why. Right? I think that this curiosity and this frustration really often comes from a place of discomfort and fear. It's really scary to know that in the world there are people who are cruel, who harm people, who might harm me, who might harm someone I love, and that there may not be a lot I can do to stop that. That sucks. That is scary, right? So it is comforting. It's a comforting delusion to think like, oh, well, it could never happen to me because I don't act like that, right? So I'm going to ask this person, like, where were they? So I won't go to that place. Or like, who were they with? Because I won't hang out with those people. Or like, what did they do? Because I know then I can do something different. That's really comforting in some ways, but it is an inaccurate belief, right? It might make me feel like I have control over something that feels profoundly out of my control, but I still don't. There is nothing that a person can do to ask for an assault or to deserve an assault. So these kinds of like victim blaming narratives, they pop up in really surprising places. And I want us to really think about just how pervasive and how damaging that can be, and why therefore it's so important to just believe, right? Like an example, this came up literally this week. Someone made a meme that was essentially, I hope Harvey Weinstein is raped in prison. And I've heard that joke a couple times over the last couple months. And like, let's think about the implication of that statement, right? The implication is that rape is something that happens to bad people who deserve it, or that sometimes it's a fair punishment for a bad act. How harmful is that narrative, right? Even when directed at an objectively bad person, it can definitely lead to survivors who are not bad people feeling shame and guilt for someone else's actions. So believing without those questions and really making sure that we are always positioning the perpetrator as the person at fault and never the survivor is really, really vital, and really goes a lot further than just our actions during a disclosure. And I'll pause here in case there were any questions that came up.
There were actually.
Oh, great.
One person asks, what do I do if I'm partway through this process and I realize I've made a mistake and I've suddenly begun to make things worse?
Partway through, I'm assuming that this person is asking like partway through the process of receiving a disclosure.
That is what I would assume, yes.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the most important things we can do is be vulnerable and be humans. Like, you're gonna screw up. You are going to. I screw up. We all screw up. Nobody is perfect. And what's really harmful is when we try to like pretend that everything's fine. And what can be really powerful is to really just like show up in that moment and acknowledge, right? Like, ooh, wow, you know, I realized that I was just asking you a lot of questions. And I'm noticing that it's because I feel really sad and I feel really scared and I'm really upset about what happened to you. I'm so sorry that I was asking those questions. If you would like to keep talking, I'm going to work really hard on making sure that that I don't keep doing that. And if you would rather, we can connect some other time. Like, you can be a person and be vulnerable, and just know that, you know, part of the process is really being a full human person, right? Sometimes we can't keep our poker face. I have had moments with survivors in the ER where I have said like, yeah, that really makes me upset too. I've even had moments where I have decided that in this moment, it is important for me to step out of that neutral zone and to share something about myself. Like, I've made that decision, and sometimes I think that's a good decision. So none of these are like prescriptions that have to be true always. And when you show up as a real and whole human, I think that is really freeing for other people that you're speaking with. Were there other questions that came up with that, or any follow-ups?
I don't know about follow-ups to that one, but we did have another question, but I'll
Sure.
leave time for follow-ups to that one if people have clarifying questions they want to ask. Another one that was asked is, what if the person is uncertain about whether what happened to them wasn't okay?
Yeah. So that is one of the moments when like being there fully with them and not adding your opinions is the most essential. We have a lot of power as the listener and as the person who's receiving that disclosure to like change a person's perception of an event. And like, you don't get to define what happened for someone else. And that's really hard, right? Because I have a lot of feelings as a human and as like about what is true, but I don't get to make that decision for someone else. So if someone is coming to me making a disclosure and they're saying like, I don't know if it's okay what happened to me. I don't know, like, does this count? Does this not count? I'm not going to say like, well, cool, I'm going to whip out my dictionary and we're going to pull up the definition of assault and we'll just see if you like check all that box, right? What I'm going to do is be there with them. Like, oh, well, I'm really sorry. That must feel really frustrating to not really like know how you feel, right? And I'm going to let them go through the process they need to go through. And I'm going to offer them resources and maybe help walk them through some things. I think sometimes it's really helpful to give folks examples from other people's experience. Like, you know, a lot of survivors have shared with me that they felt really uncertain about what to do. Right, because it normalizes and it makes the person feel less alone. Like, oh, hey, other people have done this before. I'm not abnormal. But I mean, they might not figure it out, right? Sometimes we can hold both of those things at the same time. Like, I think that this thing that happened was wrong. I also don't know if I think it was as wrong as those other things. I don't know. It's weird. Like, there's a lot more gray area in there, and sitting with someone in the gray area is a service.
I mean, I've also experienced it from the other side. I wonder if any of your training touches on this, where I've had a friend come to me and say, hey, I'm not sure if what happened was entirely okay, because I was drunk and my memory of what I did, what I asked for, what I proposed, and what then eventually happened was entirely consensual, and I feel like I might have done something wrong. What do you think?
Yeah. And that's a really unique and hard moment as well. It's a disclosure of its own kind. And I think this is one of the things that I saw really come up more often in conversation, particularly after the Me Too conversation began to be so public and so constant, that there were a lot of people in my life, particularly folks who were male identified, but not exclusively, who were looking back on experiences they'd had and being like, whoa, hold on a second. Like, was that okay? Like, what did I do? And I think like really the same principles apply of really being there with that person and being non-judgmental and really helping them sort through things, and helping them take responsibility for the things that they can take responsibility for, right? And doing that with compassion and love is really important, right? I've said before, and I'll say again, like, it's not an accident. People who commit sexual violence, like, they made an active choice. That does not mean that every single person who's done something out of line is like immediately a person who I'm going to write off as a human being. Right? There are a lot of people who make decisions like, I'm going to drink a bunch at this party and I'm going to hook up with someone. And like, maybe that decision was a decision that resulted in them assaulting someone, right? And they might not be aware of that. That doesn't mean I'm going to think like, well, forever this person, I'm going to cancel them, or like, I'm too old to talk about cancel culture, but like, maybe that's what that is. And so being there with them non-judgmentally and saying like, yeah, it really sounds like you screwed up. What do you think you can do now? That's big too, and hard.
So I'm curious to kind of go back to this. Who does that person turn to validate whether or not they were harassed or assaulted? I mean, who can make that judgment? If
they were the perpetrator, or if they were the survivor?
They were the survivor.
I think they get to make that judgment. And so they can turn to folks like us at SASS. I mean, absolutely okay to reach out and say like, I'm not sure what happened. Or I'm not sure how I feel about what happened. They can reach out to other supportive listeners, like, you know, other folks who are on this call are clearly really working hard to be allies. And, you know, and they can do the internal work. And it's also okay if those things change over time, right? You know, I know that for a lot of us who are now like incredibly ancient, as I am in my whole very old 30s, like I look back on things in high school that I did and I'm like, wow, 10 years ago, I felt like, you know, what happened to me was incredibly harmful, or like, wow, I really feel like that was abuse. And I can look back on it, you know, now and think like, wow, I was like a messed up kid who was like trying really hard and like got in a bunch of trouble. Like, good for me. I'm glad I survived. And it's also okay for like those stories to change over time and to change with how we feel about who we are and what kind of power we have in the world. These are such good questions, my friends. I really appreciate all of them. I want to be mindful about time, so I'm going to just keep moving on. But again, if more questions come up, please do throw them in. I'm so appreciative of the complexity of these. It really shows me that like this is a group of people who are genuinely willing to like think through the difficult stuff.
We do have somebody who raised their hand.
Please.
I don't know if that person has access to the chat or not, so I'm just going to unmute this person.
Sure, go ahead.
Hey.
Sorry, I just figured it would be easier if I explained it, because it's kind of, I don't know how quite to explain it, but it was something you were talking about earlier, like it's so important to not ask questions when someone is telling you about their experience. And this is something that I'd like to think I've gotten a lot better with, but like I am a supernaturally inquisitive person. And so in a lot of situations before I really like learned this for, you know, really, like I didn't know. So I feel like it's a very natural human tendency to just want to understand what happened.
Yeah.
And so when you see someone do that and you want to explain to them like why that's maybe not the best decision to make, what advice do you have for like giving that guidance, or like obviously probably not in the moment, but after, or like pulling them aside, or how would you suggest going about that? Just because it's also something where people can feel really attacked when you're like, hey, like you shouldn't handle, or, you know, the way that you handled that was maybe not the best.
Yeah. Oh, that's an excellent question. Thank you for asking. And you're right, that is really hard. And again, this is a natural human impulse, right? Like there is an evolutionary benefit to being a species that is really inquisitive and trying to figure out like, oh, is there bad harm over there? I should maybe avoid it. So I don't think anyone needs to like beat up on themselves at all if they are an inquisitive person. I also am. And if I were in a, you know, I've been in a situation where I'm, you know, training folks to do the kind of work that I do. What I would say when I was giving feedback is I would probably just say, you know, here are all the many good things that I saw you do. Here's what I really love. And I just want to check in and, say that, often the kinds of questions that we're throwing out in moments like that, they can feel really important. Especially because I know as a person providing services, sometimes I'm like nervous that I'm not going to be able to give that survivor everything they need. So I want to have more information so that I have more to work with. So it makes a lot of sense that we might be asking a lot of questions in that moment. And I'm just gonna challenge you to sit with that the next time it comes up. And have that little bit of a pause between a question popping up in your mind and popping out of your mouth. And just, if that question is arising, really check in and ask yourself, is this information that I need to know to provide better service? Or is this information that is coming from some other place? Because sometimes there are questions I need to know, right? If I need to ask, do you feel safe going home tonight? That is a relevant question that I might need to ask. Do you feel safe in your living situation? So if I have that question pop up in my mind, I can just pause with myself for a moment and say okay, do I really need to know this? Yeah, I probably want to make sure that they're safe. Okay. Versus how many people were there? I might not need to know that, right? Does that answer your question? You may already have been muted again, so I hope that it does. And if not, please feel free to throw that into the chat or to raise your hand again. But it's a really tough thing to offer that kind of feedback. And I'm glad that you're thinking about those ways that we can continue to support others around us who are doing the same thing.
Mackenzie, did that cover it?
I mean, I just popped in the chat, I do think things are different in a personal situations as opposed to training. So just if you have any advice on that more specifically, just because it is such a different world, me having conversation with a family member is so different from a colleague.
Yeah. Oh, it is. All those power dynamics, right? And all those relational things. It's so hard. I know I'm going to probably say this 1,000 times, but I really think that vulnerability is almost always the best place to go, right? If I need to offer feedback to my sister or my best friend, I'm automatically uncomfortable doing that. There's a lot of weird stuff there. And so I will probably go into it saying that, oh, I feel really uncomfortable. I don't want to be telling you that you did something wrong. I don't want to make you feel defensive, and I really don't want you to feel attacked. But I just want to throw out there that one of the things that I was noticing is you asked a lot of questions, and it makes so much sense to me why you might do that. And from my experience, I've learned that asking a lot of questions can feel pretty crummy for the survivor. And so I just wanted to share that with you. And I appreciate you. I'm just going to acknowledge how uncomfortable I feel, and I'm going to go from there. Really good question and really complicated. Thank you for asking that. Trevor, are there any more questions?
I think that'll do it for now.
Okay, yeah, thank you all. These are fantastic. You are really thinking it through. Okay, so believing, not questioning. So next, let's talk about validating, right? So whatever a person is feeling is okay. And that is just, again, an important space that you are holding for them, that whatever their emotions are, however those emotions arise, that is all right. We've already sort of talked about this in supportive listening techniques, but I kind of want to build on that a little bit, right? Because it's one thing to say, I understand, I'm so sorry, it's okay for you to feel like crap right now. That is all really, really good stuff. But it's also really helpful to have a little bit more understanding about how trauma functions so that you, A, are not expecting any particular kind of response, and B, so that you really can validate that survivor's feelings honestly, right? If a survivor is saying I feel like I must be, this is so weird. I know I'm acting so weird right now. It's really helpful to be able to say from a position of knowledge, actually what you're describing is really, really common. A lot of people feel that way. So I would really love for us to spend hours and hours just really getting to the brain. I love all that stuff. But that again is its whole own thing. And there will be some resources that I give you at the end of this presentation. But the really quick and dirty 2-second summary of that is that trauma does not always look the way that we expect it's going to look. So we can't assume how a person is going to present their trauma because trauma is not just one thing. It's not just crying or feeling shocked. Some people are criers and some people aren't. And trauma is also different from just like a big feeling, right? So I, as a human, I will share with you all, I'm the kind of human who is liable to cry. Like if I even like hear the music from certain dog food commercials, like I'm that kind of crier. But in experiences of like in traumatic moments, I will not cry. Like I will be stone-faced, I will be steely. And so a person who expects like, oh, Martina is the kind of person who cries in Disney movies as an adult, like she's probably going to cry right now because she just broke her leg. Like I bet she's crying. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go bring her a box of tissues. I don't need that box of tissues in that moment, right? And if that person is expecting that I'm going to be crying, they might also be like, oh, I don't know, maybe Martina's leg isn't broken because she's not crying. So that can be really like a negative space to be approaching that survivor, right? To be assuming and then providing support for not the actual person, but for your assumption about them. So understanding trauma in a more nuanced sense is really useful. So some of the symptoms that a person who has PTSD, whether that's an official diagnosis or not, or a person who's just in the aftermath of a traumatic experience, some things we might expect to see. Memory loss and confusion is one of the big ones. And this is something that is really hard for a lot of survivors to cope with because we genuinely do not have good memory storage, like overall. Like we have this assumption that memory is like I go and I pull down my VHS tape of my memory and I put it in, and we don't even have VHS tapes anymore, but like whatever. And then I rewind and I watch it again and then I put it away. And that's not how memory works. And particularly in trauma, we don't store these like clear linear memories most of the time. So people are actually more likely to remember sensory details because those are stored in a different place, like smells, sounds, things like that. So often that makes people really anxious that they don't have a really good recall of what happened because that might make others question the validity of their disclosure, right? So acknowledging that and really being able to validate, like it is so common for folks to not remember, like, hey, look, this is why the brain is doing that. That can be really important. Many people experience like jumpiness and anxiety and hypervigilance because their body has just had essentially the fight, flight, freeze triggered, right? And now they can't just turn that off immediately. So their body is like, didn't a bear just jump out and try to murder us? Like we should probably be on the high lookout for bears, even if I'm no longer in the forest. So really making it okay that they are feeling those things, and like even stuff like, I'll sit with you tonight, or yeah, we can have a nightlight on tonight. Those are things that can seem really simple, but can be really helpful in sort of reducing that central nervous system arousal that they're experiencing, that like anxiety that's like in their body. A lot of people also feel numb, blank, or dissociated. I notice a lot of survivors saying things like, this just doesn't feel like this is my life. Or I feel like I'm watching like a TV show. I feel like this is theater. But they're not really like connecting into like themselves in that moment. Some folks regress in their emotional maturity or in their independence and start really feeling like they need a lot of support. And some folks cope by like hypercompetence, by throwing themselves into work or into projects, and by excelling. And so all of those are really normal. And again, important to have that as a frame of mind, right? If I, if I had a friend who experienced a trauma and afterwards I was like, well, hey, they seem fine. Like they're churning out the A papers. So I think that they're okay. That might actually be the way that they are coping with their trauma. So really having that more nuanced understanding of like the unpredictability of some of the traumatic experiences and the difference for each person can be really helpful as you're validating those feelings. I'll pause for any questions if any have come up.
I wonder, I do have a question that has been put into the queue, but I'm not sure where to put it, and I'm not sure if now would be the time, or I just want to do a time check. How are you doing on the rest of the presentation?
I have like 2 slides left.
I think I'll hold it for the Q&A portion after then.
Okay. All right, so we are on our last skill then. So our last skill to develop is supporting people to access services without deciding for them. right? So first of all, like, you are already doing this work because you are learning about services that exist, and you are learning more skills to be a supportive person. So A+, you're already doing great. But really learning how to support people, first of all, means like knowing your role and staying in your lane. If you're taking a disclosure in a professional capacity, you still have professional boundaries and professional duties that you need to be responsible for, particularly if you are a mandatory reporter. I think it is your ethical responsibility to make sure that you are disclosing that early and often, and that if you do have to make a report, that you include the survivor in that experience, that you tell them, that you let them be in charge. This is so important. But if you're just taking that disclosure as a person, also really check in with your role and stay in your lane, right? Check in with your own personal capacity and skills. It's okay to acknowledge that it feels really good to be trusted by someone enough to receive a disclosure. Like, it feels good to think like I'm important to someone, right? It's flattering to be told like you're the only person I can tell I need you. That feels good. Like, that makes me feel good as a human. And that is okay. That doesn't mean anybody's a bad person. But what wouldn't be okay is letting that pleasurable feeling dictate actions. So be honest with yourself about your capacity. You might actually not be the best person to help them in that moment, right? Maybe you don't know. Like, you literally do not know the answer to the questions that they're asking. Or maybe you are way overloaded and like triggered, and you're having a hard time keeping like your emotions in an okay place. Or maybe like you're just really goddamn tired. You know, like you have a friend who is having a hard time sleeping after a trauma, and they want to stay up all night and talk to you, and you really want to be there for them. But like, I don't function well after night after night after night of no sleep. Right? So I might need to really be honest then about my capacity. Like, I'm not personally a trained suicide prevention counselor. So there have been times for sure when I am talking to folks who are experiencing suicidal ideation, and I can be as supportive as I can be up to a point. And then I might need to call in some folks who have that expertise, because I don't. And it's okay to step back and to say, you know, I really want to be there for you. And I just have to be honest that in this moment, I'm not sure that I can do for you all the things that you deserve right now. I'm not sure that I can give you what you really deserve in this moment. How would you feel about us reaching out to the suicide hotline? Or how would you feel about us going together to the counseling center? Does that feel okay to you? Right? So you can still be there with them while you're supporting them to access those services. You don't have to abandon them. But also acknowledge that like you might be past your capacity. And like, notice in that scenario that I just gave, like, I didn't say like, you need therapy and I'm not a therapist, so we're going to the counseling center, because the survivor is in charge, not me, right? Like, my personal bias is that everyone deserves therapy early and often, but I'm not the dictator, right? So I don't get to make that decision. And I'm not going to decide what that survivor needs, even if they are not sure yet what they need. Sexual assault as a form of trauma is particularly about somebody taking power away from the individual, right? And I'm not going to replicate that in my actions. Everything that I need to do needs to be about the survivor taking back agency and feeling control and power, and not about me deciding for them. I might think I know what's best. I might have my own biases. I might make my own assumptions, and maybe the survivor doesn't even know yet what's best for them. But it's not my job to decide. It's my job to help give them the resources they need so that they can figure it out themselves. And that is so much harder when it's somebody you love. It's a lot easier in my professional role to be able to do some of these things, right? Because I have those professional duties that I can fall back on. I have that distance I can fall back on. If it's my friend, that is so much harder. And so I really don't want to pretend that this is like an easy step, but I also really want to push us, especially in situations where the survivor is someone we care about and where someone we love, that we not find ourselves in a place where we have decided for them what's right. So those are our 4 steps, really simple and yet so complex. And like anything, you know, these skills, they are a lifelong practice, and you're going to get better at them the more you do them. I've been doing this for a long time. I can listen without making any facial expression because I spent years teaching sex ed to children. So people can say like whatever weird or upsetting things to me, and I will never laugh because I've heard it all before. You might not be there in your process. That's okay. You're going to get better the more you do it. And when you do it wrong, that is okay because you are a human too. So developing your comfort with all this is really a fantastic preparation for working with trauma, no matter what type of trauma, and regardless of the context. So we might have some more questions. I'm going to put my contact info up on the screen again. Please feel free to contact me. Again, there's the 24-hour crisis line. And I really want to say that email is not as secure or confidential as it needs to be for me to do advocacy. So please feel free to reach out to me at that email address if you have like questions that you want to talk to me about, if you want like to talk about career stuff or like whatever. But for advocacy specifically, I'm going to encourage folks to call the crisis line for that. Any questions?
Yeah, so I don't feel comfortable that I'm going to rephrase this, so I'm just going to read this word for word.
Great, thank you for being considerate about that.
I wasn't thrilled with Martina's answer about how only the survivor can say whether it was sexual assault or not. For example, in my experience, nobody believed me when I initially disclosed, and so I convinced myself that it was my fault, and it wasn't until it came up in therapy years later that I realized that what happened was not okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, thank you for saying that. I think that's a really, really important story, and I so appreciate you sharing that. And I appreciate you pointing out the way that like my language really was not as useful as I wanted it to be in that moment. So what I want to say about that is that you are absolutely right that having someone support a survivor to figure out what is true for them is really, really important. So being believed and having the space to like know what is true is important. And when we don't have people who are reflecting and who are helping us get to that place, we can often, like you said, like pretend it wasn't real or pretend it didn't happen that way. And that's really harmful. So again, I want to point to things like, here are some examples from other survivors or things like that. What I really want to say about like the survivor gets to decide is that it is really up to each individual person to name things for themselves. So in situations where I have had people who are like, you know, what happened to me was fine, like it's not a big deal, I just want to get out of this hospital bed and leave. I'm not going to tell them like, sit down, that was assault, right? Like that would be a really violent thing for me to do to them. What I might say is, you know, you have every right to leave, and that is totally okay. I trust your process. You know, I have to admit that what happened to you really makes me feel upset. You know, I know a lot of folks who have had experiences like yours, you know, would describe what they have experienced as a trauma or would describe what they have experienced as sexual assault. And I just want to make space for that for you. Right? So I might offer those kinds of things, but I'm never going to define for someone. And so I think that's that like nuanced distinction. And the kind of situation you're bringing up is why like walking that line is so hard. And I'm really glad that you had the space to like finally get to a place where you were able to be in a definition that feels like true and honest to you.
Thank you so much. We have another question here. How do you suggest faculty navigate disclosure? And background information on this is my institution designated all faculty as mandatory reporters, but information about who is mandated to report disclosures to Title IX is not very accessible. Sometimes students start disclosing to faculty without knowing the faculty will have to report it.
Yeah. Oh, all right. I'm just going to be like super honest as a human that I think mandatory reporting laws are laws with like fantastic intent and a really good heart that were written by people who do not work in this field. And I understand the reasoning underlying them. And like that exactly right there is why I have such a difficult time with them. I really struggle with the ethics of being a mandatory reporter. So I would say for faculty that the thing to do is to like be as like explicit about your status as possible. When I was GTF, or whatever you guys call them now, GEs, at UL while I was doing my doctorate, I had in my syllabus, I had language that explained that I am a mandatory reporter. Here is exactly what that means. I had it in my, like my, whatever the online learning space was at the time, Canvas or whatever that was. I had it on the door to my office, and I had it on my chalkboard in my office. So as many places as possible, people would see that information. Now, legally as a mandatory reporter, you can't say, stop, you're about to make a disclosure and I don't want you to. Like that would be crossing a line. But you can also say, you know, I just really want to pause in this moment. I just want to remind folks that I am a mandatory reporter and here's what that means. And so you can share whatever you feel comfortable sharing. But it sucks to be a mandatory reporter in a lot of ways. It really does. Anything else on that question thread?
All right. Well, I think I'll go ahead and stop the recording and then we can do wrap up stuff. So thank you everybody for being here, and that'll be the end of the recorded section.
Amazing. So the first thing that I want to offer everyone is a game. So if we were in person, I would have made you play this game, but it is really difficult to do digitally. So I'm gonna give you this and then you can go out into your lives and play this at some point. So this is the disclosure game. So this is a way to really practice receiving a disclosure. So in this, in pairs, one person as the discloser shares what they ate for breakfast. They can like tell the truth because mundane stuff is interesting sometimes, or they can make up something super outlandish, and they can pick whatever emotion they want to pick as they disclose and give as much or as little detail as they'd like and ask for whatever they want to ask. And the listener just has to practice their active supportive listening. It's really surprisingly hard to do that. In fact, sometimes people will be like, well, I ate oatmeal. And then the listener will be like, I hear that. Yeah, I really understand. And then nothing else will be said and it's awkward, right? And sometimes somebody will be freaking out because they, you know, had a bald eagle egg for breakfast and they think that they're going to go to jail. And as the listener, you have to deal with that. So it can be really just a good way to practice being there in that discomfort and like, you know, laughing if you end up laughing and having it be zero stakes. And the final thing that I'm offering is those resources and citations that I've said. There is hopefully an actual link to Jennifer Freyd's work, but she's a UL professor, so it should be pretty easy to access. Those are two studies there, the 97 and the 2001 studies that are pretty useful in discussing disclosure and the positive or negative effects. Trauma in the Brain is a video on YouTube. At this moment in time, if you search Trauma in the Brain, it's the second one that comes up. It is Scottish, so enjoy the accents, and is made from a law enforcement perspective, but it does a really nice job of giving like the very quick overview of how the brain responds to trauma. And the last two for folks who are interested in digging in a little bit more, Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, and Peter Levine and Anne Frederick's Waking the Tiger are two unbelievable books, both of which are really like readable. They're not super academic. They're really interesting and are unbelievable in the way that they help draw the connections between the physical and the emotional sides of trauma. So I recommend those absolutely to folks who are interested. Any other questions before we stop?